This week, I'm going to talk about my best ever motorcycle trip. Now, that was a hard decision to make. You know, I've had a lot of good trips over the years, and trying to pick one that stood out was really hard. So the first thing I had to come up with is some criteria for determining what makes up for a good trip. Well, let's talk about weather. Does a good trip mean you had perfect weather throughout the entire trip? Well, no, not necessarily, and I'll tell you why. Years ago, after I'd made a lot of trips, I got to looking back on the ones that really stood out, and it appeared that those trips had one thing in common. At some point during the trip, I was hot, I was cold, I was wet, and I was dry, hence the name of the podcast. So having good weather throughout the trip is not necessarily a prerequisite for evaluating a good trip. Okay, what else? How about distance? Does the best trip happen to be the longest trip? Oh, maybe, maybe not. How about great campsites? Well, of course, I love to camp, and having a great campsite is certainly a benefit, but I wouldn't say that's a prime requisite. Same thing for hotels. To me, a hotel is just a place to sleep while I'm on the road, so that really doesn't matter. What about the food? Food could be good, could be bad. It certainly helps. How about the motorcycle? Well, that can be pretty important. Not so much what I'm riding, but just the fact it was trouble-free, no maintenance issues. But even at that, you can have problems and still end up with a good trip. How about the destination? Well, I've always believed that it's the ride, not the destination. And I think that's true over most everything I've done during my lifetime of riding. So for me, it was really all about the ride. Well, after evaluating those criteria, I think I can say probably my best trip was my longest trip. That's really the only way I could come up with one. Now, my decision to take this long trip was at a time in my life when things weren't going well professionally. I won't go into all the sordid details about it, but things weren't good. And I sat back and I thought, this is a time I need to take a long trip. And I had one in mind. So my decision was sell the house, sell the car, sell everything I didn't want, and store my furniture in a storage facility. Then what? Next decision was, what was I going to do? Well, I decided the best thing to do was just circumnavigate the country. That's something I wanted to do for a long time. But there were a couple obstacles to that. First one, I really didn't have a touring bike at that time, and that was really something I wanted for this trip. So I got to looking around, and sure enough, at the BMW dealer, which wasn't 5 miles from my house, they had an R1200RT for sale. I thought, well, that could fit the bill. So I went over, looked at the bike. I thought, well, this is nice. I like this. The price was right. And the dealer offered to give me a test drive. Well, certainly I took him up on it. So the salesman and I went out. He was on one bike. I was on the RT. And I was having a real hard time shifting that bike. It's just the gear changer just didn't seem to be working right. So we made a loop around. So by the time we got back to the dealer, I could hardly get up from first to second gear. And I parked it and I said, there's something wrong with this. I don't want to go any further on it. Well, he looked at me like I didn't know what I was talking about. But he said, okay. So I went home. A little bit later that day, he called me back and said, you were right. Linkage was messed up. We've got it fixed. You want to come back and take a look again? So I did. Bike was perfect. Got a terrific deal on it. And didn't really understand why I got such a good deal till after I'd already bought it. And it turns out the dealer's owner was selling the dealership and trying to get rid of inventory, and I ended up with a really good deal there. So cool. Now I had the bike I wanted. I was ready to take the trip. Now, I didn't have much time to prep for the trip, but I was able to get a couple 100 miles in on the bike just to get familiar with it and make sure everything was working right. And it was flawless. I thought, well, this is going to be good. Now, I was a little concerned because I was taking pretty much everything I owned with me on this motorcycle, and it was overpacked like nothing I've ever done on a motorcycle before. In my motorcycle classes, I always used to preach not overloading your motorcycle. Well, if you go to the YouTube version of this thing, you can see this bike was terribly overloaded. So I loaded the bike up, sat on it, and said, damn, this thing is heavy. I hope I'm okay on it. But as soon as I hit the road in the first couple of miles, I felt home on that bike. Even though I had too much stuff on it, I was ready to go. So off we went. So my plan was to head up the Blue Ridge Parkway to begin with, stop at a BMW rally, and head up the road. First day I was a short riding day just to kind of get broken in on the bike. Things went well. Finally made it the second day to TWO. Now, if you guys have never heard of TWO, it used to be two wheels only motorcycle resort up in Suches, Georgia, up in the North Georgia hills. It was owned by an Eastern Airlines pilot who retired and built this wonderful resort up there. Pretty rustic, nothing fancy, but it was the atmosphere. Everybody gathered up there. We had such an eclectic mix of motorcycles. You could find Lavertas and Moto Guzzis and Ducatis. They had a 50cc race during the fall or up through the mountains. It was just a fun place to be. But by the time I went up there, he had sold it. It was updated, but just didn't have the same feel to it. But the good thing was it was 45 degrees that night. And man, it was a good sleeping night in my sleeping bag there. Really enjoyed it. So broke camp the next day, continued on up the parkway. I never get tired riding the Blue Ridge Parkway. Probably my favorite road in the whole world. Where else can you find 469 miles of uninterrupted pavement on the top of the Blue Ridge Mountains? No billboards, no stop signs, no crossroads. It's just motorcycling heaven up there. So I enjoyed my time up on that. Camped at the Blue Ridge Motorcycle Campground in Caruso, North Carolina, and just made my way up north. Here's my joke of the day. There were two dogs standing in the middle of the road. No, seriously, there were two dogs standing in the middle of the road on the Blue Ridge Parkway around a blind curve. Scared me to death. Seriously high pucker factor on that one. Now, part of the reason for this trip was for my parents. Now, my parents had passed away a few years earlier, and I had their ashes. And they had grown up in Newcastle, Pennsylvania, just outside of Pittsburgh. Dad had always wanted to move back there after he retired. Mother was never interested in it. So what I wanted to do was to take their ashes up there to the church they grew up in and spread their ashes on the ground. I'd already made contact with the pastor, and he was agreeable to it. So I headed for Newcastle. Got to the church. Things had changed. It wasn't quite as lush as it used to be. But I found a good spot, and I spread Dad's ashes first, and then Mother's on top. They were always together. They were considered lovebirds in their church. They were just inseparable. And I felt like this was really taking Dad home again. So it made for a real positive impact on me for that trip. I mentioned that I was going to hit some of the BMW rallies, and there was one in the Wisconsin Dells I'd wanted to go to. So after leaving the parkway and working my way across the country, I ended up at Chula Vista Resort in the Wisconsin Dells. Beautiful area. It was getting cool and windy. They were expecting about 600 BMWs at the rally. So great time there. Some great motorcycles. I met a guy from California on a 1977 R90S. Beautiful bike. He totally restored it. He beat me by a couple hundred miles as the longest ride to the rally. I had done 2,600 miles. He had done slightly more than that, like 2,800 or something. So I missed that. Jerry's motorcycle had over 286,000 miles on it, and he bought it new in 1977. Haven't talked about my riding buddy Ronnie, but he and I traveled all over the country on motorcycles, and I'll talk about him in future episodes. But he and I had one saying. Invariably, if we looked at the day and said, it looks like an easy day, shouldn't be a problem, the easy days were always the hardest days on the road. And sure enough, after I left the rally, it was only 225 miles from the rally to the Minneapolis airport. Now, the reason I was going to the Minneapolis airport was I needed to park the bike there for about a week, head off to a telecommunications conference in Las Vegas, come back, pick up the bike, and take off again. So, piece of cake, right? 225 miles. Well, first problem was the terrible frost heaves on I-94 that just beat me to death. And the second was the violent crosswinds. It was pushing me around all day long, occasionally even to the oncoming lane. Luckily, there wasn't a lot of traffic out there. Once I got to the hotel, I was going to store my luggage there. But I found out that the shuttle that was mentioned in their ad was not a shuttle to the airport, but only to local attractions. That meant that instead of being able to change out of my riding gear, I'd now have to wear and carry my helmet and everything else with me. So off to the airport I rode, where I found that motorcycles were prohibited for parking there. Great. Couldn't find any signs for off-airport parking, so saw a super shuttle driver. Met him at a gas station and asked him about parking. Luckily, he knew several and gave me directions. And I did find a nice parking deck facility where they were very accommodating and told me to park the bike next to the office so it would be more secure. Of course, the airport turned out to be a circus too. Took the shuttle to the airport, but now the problem was that I had too many pieces of luggage and would have to check something. So I frantically rearranged everything and checked my small duffel and carried on my helmet and tank bag. But just as I got to security, I had this horrible feeling that I'd packed my laptop in the duffel that I just checked. Sure enough, I had. A mild panic set in, but I made it to Vegas, and it turns out the laptop still worked fine. The other issue was, when I got to the airport, I looked at my boarding pass and proceeded to take the long walk to C13, where I realized that it was actually G13. Well, I needed the walk anyway. Then boarded the plane and found that my reserved aisle seat had been changed to a middle seat. Well, terrific. I didn't particularly care for that. After that, everything pretty much settled down, got to my room in Vegas, unpacked, and just relaxed. So finally, the end of an easy day.